All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to help trauma therapists be their incredible selves, to be human, to be real, not just a clinician. I'm a big believer in who we are is more important than what we know. And this requires cultivating authenticity, genuineness, and vulnerability, and that requires intention. You can learn more about my courses and workshops by going to thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. Let's get started. All right, Michael, here we go. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I am thrilled to have back Dr. Michael Gaskell. Mike, welcome back, man.
It's a pleasure to be here, Guy. Thanks.
So Dr. Gaskell is a veteran principal in New Jersey and currently the principal at Hammarskjold Middle School in East Brunswick. Michael has been actively writing about highly relevant solutions to problems in educational leadership since 2018. His new book, Radical Principles, A Blueprint for Long-Term Equity and Stability at School, focuses on disrupting trauma and inequity in learners. And it's a guidebook for K-12 leaders looking for creative ways beyond the status quo to support and nurture school communities in the wake of unprecedented obstacles. Mike, welcome back.
Thanks. My pleasure.
So I know I said this to you, but you're on a mission. I mean, come on.
Yes.
You're writing books. What is going on? Why are you doing this work?
It's really, there's a couple reasons. First of all, I was a very anxious and I would now say diagnostically traumatized kid. I had an evaluation done when I was in third grade. My mom said something's not right here. And a school psychologist did this evaluation, said that I was hostile, impulsive, anxious, below grade level, and unlikely to succeed. And she actually said things like that.
No.
Now, this was the 1980s. So, it was like, tie one on kind of attitude in schools. So fortunately, we've gotten a lot better at how to treat some of those challenges today. But I never knew about this report. And one day my daughter was snooping around at my parents' house and she found this folder that just said Mike. And she opened it up and there was just an inventory of things in there. I knew I had some challenges. I never realized the degree. And I was really inspired to, use that as a baseline. I'm now a principal, as you know, and I've written 36 articles and this is my third book. And, so obviously, how did I get from there to here is huge. And,
well, hold on. But yeah. So you didn't carry that with you?
The challenges that I had?
Well, more specifically, the words, that assessment, that diagnosis in a sense.
Yeah. So I like to say that I had some accidental fortune that unfortunately does not happen for most kids today. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is my mother never told me about the report. I didn't discover that report with those descriptions until my daughter found them a few years ago and I was inspired to start writing. I was already inspired to start writing, but this was like the icing on the cake. So that was the first thing. I think my mother protected me in a wise way in that sense, without maybe necessarily even realizing back then that this probably isn't something that would be helpful to a child to share. So, and I talk about that. I'll mention this later when I talk about small wins and the power of small wins with kids. But I definitely knew there was something going on. I just always felt like I had a chance. Now, some of that, quite candidly, Guy, is because I was a white middle-class boy. So I was already gifted some advantages that I talk a lot about in my books, that where kids that are traumatized or disadvantaged, they need bridges. And so I unpack a lot of that in ways that I call my accidental fortune, because that's who I was. So I was already given some of these guardrails other kids are not. So that has to change. And I get into that.
All right. So this interest in trauma, this interest in helping kids in this way, how did that become like
real so the second part?
Yeah,
absolutely. Because I was talking about part 1 and part 2, so I don't want to leave the cliffhanger here. The second part to this is that, I was in college and I was studying speech pathology, which quite ironically was because I didn't really know what I wanted to do, and my brother was one. And he told me there was a lot of women in there, so that obviously interested me. And there's a lot of women in the field, but there's also a lot of women in education, of course. And part of my requirement in undergrad was to take a course on special education. Well, I fell in love, and I didn't quite know why, except that I could really connect with some of the challenges many of these kids were encountering. And more importantly, I felt like kids were being diagnosed with a special need when they had so many other ways. We had so many other ways and more effective ways to help them. And that some of these kids, a lot of these kids were traumatized. They were coming from broken homes. They were coming from disadvantaged backgrounds. And yes, they were, again, many times, most often traumatized. And so I fell in love and I said, I have to change my direction. And I went and got my master's degree in special education, became a special educator. And then someone along the way crazily said to me, you should be an administrator. You'd be really good with kids in a leadership role and with teachers and guiding them. So I often tell teachers this story in a PD experience. And I show my actual report that was that evaluation that was not becoming, and said, make predictions about this kid. And they say, oh, he's going to go to jail. He's going to be an addict. He's going to fail out. He's going to have all kinds of, he's going to have only an entry level experience. And I do that for a very important reason, not to say, guess what I did? More importantly, because I'm talking to my teachers. And of course, you can't do this every year with teachers because then they know who you are. So right. I just got a 60% new faculty, and I'm going to be doing this soon with those teachers that don't know yet. And the reason I do that is because I want teachers to understand that they should never give up on any child, any underdog, under any circumstance, because we can all come out of that. And I'm living proof, and there's other people that are living proof. And here's, some perfect examples. So I was really motivated to get into special education. Then I became an administrator, and I've always loved the underdog story, and helping that child realize their dreams. And I've learned some very effective ways through my own research and writing, as well as anecdotal and in-person experiences, and weaving that together to come up with some really great, viable, concrete solutions to help children who are traumatized and disadvantaged. And by the way, most often both.
So the new book, Radical Principles, and this is Principles, Principals, as in school principles.
Play on words.
A blueprint for long-term equity and stability at school. What inspired you to write this book?
It was interesting. When I wrote Leading Schools Through Trauma, which was in a previous episode with you about a year ago, I knew that I had to write that book. And I knew it because we were in a pandemic, and I was already seeing before the pandemic that kids were suffering, and that there was this rise in trauma, which of course is, I think, mirrored not just among kids, but of course, as I'm sure you would say, across the spectrum, that we're both recognizing it more and we're seeing a rise in it. So I think there's those two things that are making that more obvious. And then, of course, the pandemic hit. So I said, I have to write this book, and I pitched it to a great publishing company, and they agreed. Then I said to myself, there's more left here on the table that I left not unanswered, but as if needing more to finish this. So when I wrote Radical Principles, I thought about some of the unique things I've both done over my career and discovered other people have done that helped children with real needs. And I'm just going to mention one quote from the book that I think really spins this well. And that's that radical approaches are the sorts that are crazy the day before they're brilliant. The payoff is enormous, especially for children who are disadvantaged. Students are the real winners of fearlessly radical principles who vigorously and willfully demand equitable opportunities within their school community for all. So I really get into this. Like, I've done some really out of the box things, and I'm a tenured principal in a community that's known me forever. So I can take some chances but I talk about some of the ways to work around. One of the challenges in schools is systematized bureaucracy. We're really great at rules in schools. And unfortunately, rules just don't work for traumatized and disadvantaged kids. They don't. So we have to think of unconventional ways to reach these kids.
So when you say, so unconventional ways, radical, talk more about that. Why are those things important?
Absolutely. So I'll give you a perfect example. African-American students are suspended at 2 to 4 times the rate of their white peers for the same offense in schools. So that in and of itself is appalling. But the second problem to that is there's been decades and decades of research that prove that not only does suspension have a negative effect on that child, but also the climate of the school. So they're affecting everybody. So why are we still suspending kids? It's not working. We have to stop doing things like that. And everybody says, oh, no, they were bad. They did this, they did that. Here's the bottom line. If a child doesn't do something illegal, they don't get suspended in my school. And I took some time to really help teachers understand why. I'll give you one really quick example. I had a child who was clearly traumatized, and he was a good kid, and he was a classic challenge. He ran too fast. He talked too loud. And teachers would wave that proverbial finger at him and corner him, and he was towering over them, and they were disciplining him. And it was having no effect on him. He just turned right back around and run again. So one day, but there was some potential in this kid, just like there is every kid. And I said to that kid, would you like to read to our preschoolers who we have in this school if you're good for a week? And I thought he'd laugh at me. And he said, I'd love to do that. I brought him in. He read. Here's what I found out. He can read a Dr. Seuss book, but he does have literacy challenges. So that not only gave him some confidence, but 3-year-olds are like pet therapy. They don't see a big, scary kid. They see a person reading a wonderful story that they love to them and high-fiving them and everything. This kid's behavior shot, and so did his achievement, by the way, straight up. And he became the cool kid who was reading to the preschoolers. So now I've got other kids coming up to me and saying, how do I get to read? And these were some of the toughest kids in the school. And I'm like, well, you have to do this, this, and this. And they would do it. And not all the time and not perfectly, but there was this incredibly upward curve of growth and climate change in the school. And we were not we went from suspending 6.5% of our population to 1.9%. And more importantly, the biggest drop off of that was, of course, our disadvantaged populations and our traumatized populations. So it was incredible to see that. And that's just one quick example of many unconventional things I do. And teachers at first would say to me, this isn't going to work. They're just going to keep getting in trouble. And then they started going down the hall and saying to them when they started to run a little too fast, hey, when are you reading next? And they never addressed the actual problem, but they redirected that child to, oh, this is something that's I'm a part of that's a bigger and more important message than running down a hall. And they never had to say to him, slow down or scream. And the kid stopped. So these are some of the things that I talk about. It's like basic psychology, I know, but we sometimes forget about basic psychology. Another example is feedback. Unfortunately, kids that are disadvantaged and traumatized receive far less feedback. And by that, I mean constructive and supportive feedback than their peers. And that's a real problem because ironically, the kids who need it the most are getting it the least. And there's a 19-word phrase, and I don't remember the exact words, by the way, but it doesn't matter. The idea is this: I believe in you, and I know you can do this because I have high expectations for you, and I know you'll have high expectations for yourself. That's the general essence of this. Dan Coyle did this study on this, a famous author, and he found that there was a 40% productivity improvement for most kids. Well, guess what? There was a 320% productivity improvement for African-American kids. So guess what? They're not used to getting that kind of feedback. Right. And we need to turn that on its side and start giving them that kind of feedback.
All right. So this is amazing what you're saying. And it's so inspiring. And it's something about it. It's very sad, the reality of it. So I want to jump back to something you said about the suspensions. So for kids who are doing something, are they getting consequences?
So here's where you have to turn things on its side. If a child's not doing something illegal in my school, I didn't say they weren't getting something. Right. What I said, and that's a very important distinction here. What I meant to say or clarify here is that they are getting something far more effective, and that's a positive intervention. So we have a program here which leans on restorative justice. I'm sure you've heard of restorative justice. And restorative justice is this concept that when somebody does something that is inappropriate or destructive or whatever, that we can come up with a positive and constructive way for them to learn from that, so that it's not punitive, but it is focused and targeted on what's the real problem here? Why are you doing this? So a few years ago, I came up with this idea. it's called a schoolhouse adjustment. Okay. And I'll explain that real quick here. Schoolhouse adjustment, because schools all of a sudden got all these security officers, and most of them nowadays are retired police officers. And here's the problem: disadvantaged and traumatized children and their families often have a disdain for, and right or wrong, law enforcement, and vice versa. I had to change that. So what did I do? I brought these school resource officers who were retired police officers. And the good thing about them is they usually come into schools because they like kids and they want to work with kids. So they're like an uncle to these kids. And I said to them, look, instead of suspension, I'd like you to do a restorative, experience with them. Bring them in, do a little lesson, cause and effect. You did this. How can this affect me in the real world? How could this affect me in school? How could this affect my grades? What are some of the more promising and positive things I can do? And then the best part of this is that school resource officer who never punished this kid, they become a mentor to this kid. They see him in the hall and say, hey, how you doing? And they're high-fiving and they're talking. And then suddenly that kid's not just seeing a difference with law enforcement, but that kid's going home and saying to mom and dad, guess what? This guy, he was like an uncle to me. He gave me a snack this morning. He told me he believed in me. He had this great activity with me. He meets with me now on a regular basis. And the families now, who, again, right or wrong, have a feeling about law enforcement. Now they're hearing, oh, there's a person from law enforcement who's helping my child. And suddenly you start to turn your community's perspective around. And so this is just another example of one of those many things that we need to do for kids instead of punishing them.
When you, so I mean, this is a paradigm. It's a paradigm shift in how we're treating kids. There's so many synapses that are firing for me right now, one of which is, what kind of buy-in, quote unquote, do you need to have from teachers that are coming on board?
Ironically, not just teachers, but parents. Parents will be the first ones to say to you, I want justice. I want to know what was done to that other kid. Okay. Or I want to know if you're going to take care of my kid, whatever the circumstance is. So I think one of the problems is that I use this terminology, we have to institutionalize equity, not inequity. We've already done a good job of institutionalizing inequity. Now we have to shift that. And you can't do that without getting this buy-in you just talked about. So one of the most important things to remember about this is that you have to lead by example. So I want to give you some quick examples. I had a lot of naysayers with that middles to littles reading program that I talked about earlier, where the kid came in and read, and they didn't believe it was going to work. And by they, I mean some of the strongest, most informal leaders in my school community who basically have more power than I do. So the only thing I could do is take a risk. So I talk a lot about taking important and measured risks in doing this. By the way, I don't recommend doing all of this at once. I recommend incremental steps, and it takes time, but it's worth the investment. So you have to start leading by example. The other thing for me is, ironically, one thing I learned is that when you start writing, suddenly everybody starts believing what you're talking about. So I do encourage education leaders to write, and there's tons of blogs and things like that, because now I can say, hey, look, I got published. And that's the thing that gets you over the edge, then it's worth it. But like I said, I didn't start there. I started with leading by example, and then I could reference some of those examples. So there is a real shift in this. I also do a lot of, professional development. I used the example earlier of my own story. I think we all have a story of vulnerability that if we share with our staff or share with our community, they think, wow, that guy who seems to have it all together went through that. And they suddenly connect to that and say, well, you know what? I think I have some kids like that too, or I've been through that own experience myself. So you start to bring all these pieces together, and it's this idea of stacking or consolidating these ideas so that people start to get really persuaded in ways they don't even realize, and they jump on board. What always happens in schools is you've got basically three groups of people. The first group is a group that's going to jump into everything because they love you. And that group hopefully is large. But if it's not, you've got a second group, and they're kind of on the fence. They're sitting there watching you and waiting. And then the third group is the constant naysayers. You will always have a group of naysayers. They think the glass is half empty. They wonder why it's raining when it should be sunny, and when it's sunny, it should be raining, and vice versa. right? They're never happy about anything. Fortunately, you can reduce the power of that group and minimize the number of people in that group by doing some of these things I talked about, and not putting it in their face. In Radical Principles, I talk a lot about the importance of leadership humility. You're not going to sit there and say, pound your chest and say, this has got to be the way it's got to be. You're not going to get anybody on board doing that. It's all about the power of persuasion. Persuasion is more significant than force. And you're going to get people to move when you start to show them and lead them and treat them as human beings too. The other thing I'll say about teachers real quick is they're desperate for answers right now. They're desperate. They need help. We just came out of a pandemic. My school, perfect example. The kids in my school are 5th and 6th graders. They spent half of their educational life in quarantine. It's no wonder they're traumatized, socially and developmentally delayed, and are doing strange things, quite frankly. So teachers are desperate for answers. So we have to seize the moment and give them some of those answers. And it's not in punishment.
When someone comes on board, a prospective teacher, do you go through all this and see what their buy-in level is at first?
Yeah, you know what's really interesting about that? I don't know if I mentioned this to you on air, but I'm going to just mention it now. So my school went from a 6-7 middle school to a 5-6 upper elementary, or like a lower middle school, however you want to call it. And 60% of my faculty are new to me. They're not new to the district, but because of all that restructuring, almost 2/3 of my faculty is brand new to me, and they didn't know who I was. So I needed to have really important conversations with them. And that's where you start with this. And I talk about this in the book as well, by the way, that conversations, I talked about feedback earlier, right? Well, that goes along the same lines as having important conversations, hearing what people's concerns are, hearing what their doubts are, and then not going right at them with it. I talked about doing a lot of this sidestepping with kids. It's the same thing with adults. It's the same basic psychology. And when you take the time to give one really powerful example, then you're going to be able to influence them. The other thing is I still do have 40% of my staff who would run around this building 3 times for me if I asked them to. And why? Because when they came to me and said to me, and I talk about trust and building trust in the book as well. When a teacher came to me and said, I have to leave 15 minutes early, do I have to put in for a half a day? Well, I'll be honest with you. And I can say this because I'm a tenured principal. My district superiors would say, yes, they have to put in a half a day. And I say, that's crazy. And I say to them, no, you're not losing a half a day. Or I don't say to them, you have to stay for the whole day. I say, go take care of your sick child or whatever the issue is, and I got you covered. Why do I do that? Because they give it back to me tenfold. The next time I ask them to try something or take a risk, they're willing to do it. They might have doubts, but they're willing to do it. They're willing to take that next step in the process. And it's all about taking the next step in the process. And then they start to realize this stuff works. And they get excited about it.
What's so interesting / inspiring about you in general, but about what you're saying, Mike, is that what you're saying is applicable, is transferable.
Yes,
to everything we're doing. And I can see a lot of other books coming down the pipeline for you in terms of that. But what you're saying in terms of, looking at kids, looking beyond the behavior. And it's the same thing with therapists too. It's very easy to see the behavior and to be blinded by the behavior and just deal with that rather than really taking the time and being willing to look beyond that. But the fact that you're doing this, that you feel compelled to do this, what is this saying about the state we're in?
Well, look, we live in a much more polarized world than we used to. And I think, there's a lot to attribute to that. Much, again, goes to this affects trauma too. I think about, comparison is a thief of joy, a famous Teddy Roosevelt thing. And kids, are locked into comparison, and they're constantly doing that on social media, and how damaging things like social media can be to them. So I don't say to them, don't use social media. I try to teach them how to use it. And we get into some really specific examples. So the reality of the situation is we are in a very bare, transparent world that sometimes doesn't make a lot of sense to kids. And I think we have a responsibility to give them some options, to teach them how to manage that. I just wrote an article that's going to come out in January, so I don't know when this will air, but it was about how to teach kids in a politically divided world. And I get into really objective management of this. We have all the tools in school. See, that's the great thing about these ideas too, is we have all these tools. We just need to remember to use them and to be inspired to use them. So I try to do my best to do that. And I think as leaders, we have to be the champions of these kinds of things and motivate teachers and give them reasons to feel good about it. By the way, that feedback in that 19-word thing, teachers need that too. Mm-hmm. So, it's like you said earlier, this is really a larger problem than just in schools. And schools are just kind of like the breadbasket of that, and everything else, becomes a larger portion of that. If I may, a really quick story just to illustrate this. So there was a kid, I was a brand new principal, and I was definitely unproven at this point. And I had a teacher come into my office, and she had smoke coming out of her ears. She had a kid in tow, and the kid looked angry. And the teacher said, this kid said you allowed her to carry her backpack, which, by the way, who really cares about that? But this was apparently a rule I had inherited. And I had never said this to this kid, but it didn't matter. I had to get this teacher out of the office and away from this kid. And there was something more going on with this kid. I could tell by her body language. So when the teacher, I said, I got this. And the teacher kind of backed up, waiting for me and giving me this look like, are you really going to take care of this? And I brought the kid in my office. And before I said anything about the backpack and breaking this rule, I said to her, are you okay? Is there something I'm missing? And she said to me, my mom didn't come home last night. And I said, really? And I said, okay, let's see if we can find your mom. Now, again, notice I didn't say a word about this damn backpack, but I needed to find this mom. So I made a few phone calls, spent about 20 minutes, talked to her grandmother. We tracked her mom down. I got her on the phone with her mom.
Oh, boy.
Kid was so appreciative. Oh. And this was a tough kid. She was a tough kid. So she would curse at you. She would do things behind your back and everything. But here's the thing. I spent 20 minutes with this kid, and I never had a problem with her again. And then I said to her, by the way, we do have to talk about this backpack. And she stood up, and I didn't know if she was going to hit me or what. And she said to me, I will never carry my backpack in the hall again. And every time I saw her in the hall, if she got a little bit out of hand, because she wasn't perfect, I'd look at her and I'd smile, and she'd suddenly shift her behavior. Mm-hmm. And I never had an issue again. That teacher came to me and said, what did you do to that kid?
Oh my God.
And I said, I'll tell you about it someday. And I had to wait a couple of years to really divulge to that teacher, because she couldn't process that instead of punishing a kid and holding them accountable, I held her accountable, but I taught her a very important lesson, that I cared about you first. And so some of this goes along with that we just have to get back to empathy in this world.
What an awesome story, man. That's a heartwarming story. And it's just it just takes a second, and to just shift and to ask the right question and to care enough to ask the right questions.
And I mean, I was a busy principal. I was new. I had to do a million things, but it was more important to me to take that 20 minutes. And I do that with kids all the time. And sometimes it pays off like that. And sometimes it doesn't. Kids don't really care. But there's something else. I talked about stacking earlier. There's other ways to get to kids. And we can't just try one way and say, well, that didn't work. Let's give up on this kid.
Mm-hmm. All right. Mike Gaskell, the book is called Radical Principles, A Blueprint for Long-Term Equity and Stability at School. Who's this book for?
This is for educators and parents and grown kids when they get to it. But mainly it's for educators and educational leaders. I do include educators in that because they will definitely benefit from reading this.
Mm-hmm. And how do you hope they will benefit?
I think it will give them a different perspective, and will also give them hope. So often we look at kids and we say, that kid will, like me, right? That kid will never accomplish anything. And I think they need to hear stories like that. And by the way, I weave science and story together. So I'm bringing research along with real principles and real leaders and real teacher stories, so they can appreciate that. We all know that when we tell a story, it's far more impactful than just spewing facts. Mm-hmm. And because we can align ourselves to that, we can mirror what's going on in that story and almost feel like we're living vicariously through it, like any great story. So I think it's really important to tell things in both a solvable way and in a storyline, so that people can appreciate it. So that's what it's for. And that's how it will, I think, reach people.
So before we go here, just one more question. So you're doing Or let me ask you this: is what you're doing? How common is what you're doing?
I don't think it's common at all. And I can get away with this because, and I talk a lot about this in the book. There's a lot of bureaucracy in schools, and we are great at making rules. And what we do? We institutionalize inequity when we do that. And it's so important to take calculated risk. I don't tell anybody to go out and be a rebel and lose their job. In fact, I say that in the book. Don't put yourself in a precarious position. And we all have different personalities and levels of risk tolerance. But the whole point is we need to think through cleverly how we're doing a lot of these things. And a lot of it is organized around that humility I mentioned earlier. Mm-hmm. We can do these things convincingly if we remain humble and we're clever about it. So I get into how to do that.
Mm-hmm. But speaking of the bureaucracy and the institutional component of it, to what degree do you feel your hands are tied just by the very nature of where you are?
Absolutely. I'm in middle management. It is really what I am as a principal. You've got central office administrators and board of ed, and I'm supervising teachers and managing parents and students. So I'm really stuck in the middle. I get into that in a whole chapter about this. And how do you manage? You're sort of like on this, you're sort of stuck between these two things, and you know the right thing, you know what needs to be done, but you also know you can't get through that. So there's two things I do. One is I often get other people to try to help me move an idea along. And more importantly, I often beg for forgiveness rather than ask for permission. So if I may, another really quick story. I had we have this bullying law in New Jersey, and it's really progressive, and its intent is good. Unfortunately, in practice, there's too much paperwork and it takes too much time when we already know a kid has not been bullied. Okay. Mm-hmm. So we need to be able to say, okay, that's not, but let's help them with conflict resolution or whatever instead. And I had a boss who said, anytime anybody mentions the word, you have to open up an investigation. Well, if that's what we were doing, that's all I'd be doing. I wouldn't be managing teachers. I wouldn't be moving some of these great ideas along. I wouldn't be doing anything, and I'd be doing it all day. So I decided to, when we knew it was an issue of conflict, just call the parent and explain that. 20-minute phone call. I modeled it for my vice principals, and I said, we're not going to open an investigation. They said, can we do that? And I said, I don't know. Let's find out. And again, I talk about calculated risk, because what's the worst thing that's going to happen? That boss is going to call me, tell me I was wrong. Don't ever do that again. The whole 9 yards. Okay, I'm sorry, I made a mistake, right? Instead, what he did was about a year later, he called me and he said, you know that letter you send to parents after you've had a conversation with them about it not being bullying? I thought, oh my God, he found out it's over. And I said, yes, and I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. And he says to me, can you send me a copy of that? I'd like to share that with the other principals. So my point here is you make a good idea so good they can't ignore it.
Right. Oh, man, Mike, I love talking with you, man.
Likewise.
So the book is called Radical Principles, a Blueprint for Long-Term Equity and Stability. It's up at where? On Amazon?
You can find it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and at the Routledge main website. But I recommend any source you're comfortable with.
Okay, awesome. Well, look, you are welcome back anytime. You're so inspiring, man. Thanks so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Take care.
You too.
I want to thank you so much for listening to this podcast, and I want to let you know that I am very excited about my new podcast, The Right Now Project. The Right Now Project is about healing. It's about stepping into our own courage and authenticity and getting started or continuing along our healing process. We're all going through something, whatever it is, in this crazy life we're living. And the Right Now Project is about honoring that, celebrating that, and sharing our stories via the associated membership site. Check us out at therightnowproject.com, therightnowproject.com.